The garden that started it all. Margaret Chen had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 23 years, long before the neighborhood transformed from a quiet suburban community into what the real estate agents now called a premier gated community. At 72 years old, she had watched the old guard of neighbors gradually move away, replaced by younger families who paid premium prices for the privilege of living behind ornate iron gates and manicured common areas. The neighborhood she once knew, where people borrowed sugar and watched each other's children, had evolved into something entirely different. A place where every blade of grass seemed regulated and every homeowner lived in fear of violation notices appearing on their doorsteps. Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. Good to have you here again. Let me know, where are you watching from today? All right, sit back and get ready, because behind these neighborhood doors, nothing stays hidden for long. Let's jump into today's story. Margaret's pride and joy was her backyard garden, a labor of love she had cultivated for over 2 decades. What started as a small tomato patch had grown into a thriving quarter-acre vegetable garden that produced an abundance of tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, peppers, herbs, and leafy greens throughout the growing season. The garden wasn't just a hobby. It was her connection to her late husband Robert, who had helped her plant the first seeds before his passing 15 years ago. Every spring when she turned the soil and every fall when she harvested the last of the season's bounty, she felt his presence beside her. The garden had also become a practical necessity on her fixed income. The produce she grew reduced her grocery bills significantly and provided enough excess to share with neighbors and donate to the local food bank. She had maintained the garden meticulously, always keeping it neat and productive. The raised beds were constructed from cedar wood that had weathered to a beautiful silver gray. She had installed a small drip irrigation system that Robert had designed, ensuring water efficiency in the increasingly dry summers. Chicken wire fencing kept out rabbits and deer, and she had even created a small composting area discreetly tucked behind a decorative lattice screen. Everything was organized, purposeful, and beautiful in its own practical way. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late April, just as Margaret was planting her summer tomatoes. She noticed a black Mercedes sedan slow down in front of her house, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out with a tablet in hand, taking photos of her property from the street. This wasn't unusual. The HOA had hired a new management company 6 months earlier, and they seemed to have inspectors constantly patrolling the neighborhood looking for violations. Margaret had received a notice once before about a small oil stain in her driveway, which she had promptly cleaned, so she didn't think much of the photographer. She was an upstanding homeowner who paid her dues on time and maintained her property well. She had nothing to worry about. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived in her mailbox bearing the official Willowbrook Estates HOA seal. Inside was a violation notice that made Margaret's hands shake as she read it. The letter informed her that her vegetable garden was in direct violation of Section 7.3.2 of the HOA's Architectural and Landscape Guidelines, which stated that all landscaping visible from neighboring properties must consist of ornamental plants, flowers, and approved hardscape features consistent with the aesthetic standards of the community. Vegetable gardens, the letter stated, were considered agricultural use and were strictly prohibited in all yards except when contained within approved decorative containers, not exceeding 4 square feet in total growing area. The notice gave her 30 days to remove the garden entirely and restore the area to approved landscaping. Failure to comply would result in fines of $500 per day beginning on day 31. Margaret read the letter 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. 4 square feet? That was barely enough space for a single tomato plant. Her garden was over 2,000 square feet. The math was staggering and terrifying. She immediately retrieved her HOA documents from the filing cabinet in her home office. The thick binder contained the original covenants, conditions, and restrictions from when she had purchased her home, along with various amendments that had been mailed to homeowners over the years. Margaret spent hours that evening reading through every page, searching for any mention of vegetable gardens. The original CCNRs from 1998 mentioned nothing about vegetable gardens specifically. There was general language about maintaining property values and keeping yards neat, but nothing that explicitly banned growing food. It wasn't until she reached the amendment section that she found what she was looking for. In 2019, a new set of enhanced architectural and landscape guidelines had been adopted. Margaret vaguely remembered receiving this document in the mail, but like most homeowners, she had filed it away without reading every detail. At the time, her garden was already well established and had never been an issue with previous HOA boards. No one had ever complained. In fact, many neighbors complimented her on it and asked for gardening advice. The 2019 guidelines were extensive, 43 pages of detailed regulations covering everything from approved paint colors to the maximum height of decorative flags. Section 7.3.2 was indeed there, buried on page 27, with the exact language quoted in her violation notice. But as Margaret continued reading, something began to trouble her. Many of these rules seemed excessive, even arbitrary. Some contradicted the original CC&Rs, and the process by which these guidelines had supposedly been adopted seemed questionable. According to the original governing documents, any amendments to the CC&Rs required a vote by the homeowners, with a two-thirds majority needed for passage. Margaret had no memory of ever voting on these enhanced guidelines. She checked her records carefully. There had been no ballot mailed to her home, no notice of a special meeting to vote on the changes. The document simply appeared one day with a cover letter from the HOA president, Richard Hutchinson, stating that the board had updated the community standards. As Margaret sat at her kitchen table that night, surrounded by HOA documents and making notes on a legal pad, a cold realization began to form. Something wasn't right about how this HOA was operating, and if they could come after her garden, something she had maintained without issue for over 20 years, what else were they capable of? She looked out her kitchen window at her garden, illuminated by the back porch light. The tomato seedlings she had planted earlier that week were already beginning to establish themselves. This garden represented her husband's memory, her financial stability, and her connection to something real and growing in an increasingly artificial neighborhood. Margaret Chen had always been a rule follower, a quiet person who avoided conflict. But as she stared at that violation notice with its threat of crippling fines, something shifted inside her. They had picked the wrong homeowner to bully. Margaret spent the next morning doing what she did best: research. Her career as a medical librarian at the county hospital system had taught her how to dig through documents, cross-reference information, and spot inconsistencies in records. Though she had retired 8 years ago, those skills remained sharp. She started by making copies of every HOA document she possessed, organizing them chronologically in color-coded folders. Then she did something she had never done before. She began systematically reading through every single page, taking detailed notes on anything that seemed unusual or contradictory. The first anomaly she discovered was in the meeting minutes from 2019, the year the enhanced architectural and landscape guidelines had supposedly been adopted. According to the HOA's bylaws, all board meetings were required to have minutes recorded and distributed to homeowners within 30 days. Margaret found the minutes from January, March, and April of 2019, but there was a conspicuous gap. No minutes from February, which was supposedly when the new guidelines had been voted on according to the cover letter she had received. It was as if that meeting had never happened, or at least had never been properly documented. She decided to reach out to other longtime residents in the neighborhood. Margaret wasn't particularly social, but she knew enough people from the early days of Willowbrook Estates to make some phone calls. Her first call was to Patricia Morrison, a retired teacher who had moved into the neighborhood just a year after Margaret. Patricia answered on the second ring, and when Margaret mentioned the HOA violation, she could hear the tension in her old neighbor's voice even before any details were shared. Patricia had her own HOA nightmare story. 6 months earlier, she had received a violation for parking her car in her own driveway overnight. The new guidelines apparently required all vehicles to be parked in garages between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., with no exceptions. Patricia, whose garage had been converted into a craft room years before the rule existed, had been forced to pay over $3,000 in fines before she could afford to have her garage converted back. She told Margaret that at least a dozen homeowners had similar stories, sudden violations for things that had been perfectly acceptable for years, followed by astronomical fines that seemed designed to extract maximum money from residents. Margaret's second call was to Tom Weber, a semi-retired accountant who lived 3 streets over. Tom had a different perspective. He had actually attended several recent HOA board meetings, something few homeowners bothered to do. What he described made Margaret's blood run cold. The meetings, Tom explained, were held on weekday afternoons at 2 p.m., a time when most working residents couldn't attend. The board members, Richard Hutchinson as president, along with Vice President Sandra Vega, Treasurer Marcus Chen, no relation to Margaret, and Secretary Jennifer Walsh, ran the meetings with military efficiency, rushing through agenda items and dismissing homeowner concerns with practiced ease. Tom had tried to raise questions about the excessive fines being levied against homeowners and the lack of financial transparency, but his comments had been shut down. Richard Hutchinson had a particular talent for using parliamentary procedure to silence dissent, calling point of order and citing obscure rules whenever someone asked uncomfortable questions. Tom had eventually stopped attending, feeling that his presence made no difference. But he told Margaret something that would prove crucial. He had noticed that the HOA's annual financial reports, which were supposed to be detailed breakdowns of income and expenses, had become increasingly vague over the past 3 years. Major expenditures were listed as generic line items like community improvements and administrative costs without any supporting documentation. Orchestrated narrative escalation through evidence gathering and legal intervention. I need to continue building the tension and show Margaret discovering more problems. She should be gathering evidence and allies while also dealing with the immediate threat to her garden. I'll introduce her decision to hire a lawyer and show more of the HOA's problematic behavior. Armed with this information, Margaret made a decision that would have been unthinkable to her just days earlier. She was going to hire an attorney. She had always been frugal, carefully managing her retirement income and late husband's pension, but this situation required professional help. She found a law firm that specialized in HOA disputes and made an appointment with an attorney named David Reeves, who had excellent reviews and a reputation for taking on difficult cases. The consultation took place in a modest office downtown, where Reeves listened intently as Margaret presented her meticulously organized folders and explained the situation. He was in his mid-40s with graying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen every type of legal dispute imaginable. As he reviewed her documents, his expression shifted from polite interest to genuine concern. He confirmed what Margaret had suspected. The adoption of the 2019 enhanced guidelines appeared to be procedurally invalid. Without a proper vote by the homeowners, these rules might not be legally enforceable. But Reeves cautioned her about something important. Even if the guidelines were invalid, fighting the HOA would be expensive and time-consuming. HOAs had significant legal resources funded by the very dues that homeowners like Margaret paid. They could drag out litigation for years, bleeding her dry with legal fees even if she eventually won. He suggested a different approach, gather more evidence of impropriety before filing any lawsuit. If there were larger issues with how the HOA was being managed, they might be able to build a case strong enough to force a settlement or even trigger an investigation by state authorities. Margaret left the attorney's office with a clear mission. She needed to find proof of financial mismanagement or other violations by the board itself. Reeves had given her a list of documents she should request under state law, which required HOAs to provide certain financial records to homeowners upon written request. The list included detailed accounting ledgers, bank statements, vendor contracts, and correspondence related to major expenditures. That evening, Margaret drafted a formal document request letter, carefully following the template Reeves had provided. She requested 5 years of financial records, including all bank statements, canceled checks, vendor contracts over $5,000, and detailed breakdowns of all expenditures categorized as community improvements or administrative costs. She also requested copies of all meeting minutes, including any executive session notes that didn't involve attorney-client privileged information. Under state law, the HOA had 15 business days to respond. She sent the letter via certified mail the next morning, requiring a signature upon delivery. The receipt would prove they had received her request and start the clock on their legal obligation to respond. As she watched the postal clerk process the certified mailing, Margaret felt a strange mixture of anxiety and determination. She was stepping into unfamiliar territory, challenging an organization that seemed to wield absolute power over her home and her daily life. The response from the HOA came faster than expected, but not in the way Margaret had anticipated. Just 4 days after her document request was delivered, she received another letter from Richard Hutchinson himself. The tone was markedly different from the impersonal violation notice. This letter was personally addressed to her and dripped with condescension barely disguised as concern. The letter stated that the board had received her extensive and burdensome records request, which would require significant administrative resources to fulfill. Hutchinson wrote that while the HOA was committed to transparency, such requests needed to be reasonable in scope. He suggested that Margaret withdraw her request and instead work with the board to resolve any misunderstandings about the HOA's operations. He even offered to waive the fines on her garden violation if she would agree to remove the garden voluntarily and sign a statement acknowledging that the enhanced guidelines were valid and enforceable. Margaret read the letter twice, and each time she grew more certain of what was happening. This wasn't an olive branch, it was an attempt at intimidation disguised as compromise. They wanted her to give up her garden and, more importantly, abandon her document request. The fact that they had responded so quickly and with such an obvious attempt to make the request go away told her everything she needed to know. They were hiding something, and they were worried about what she might find. She picked up the phone and called David Reeves. When she read him Hutchinson's letter, she could hear the smile in the attorney's voice. This, he explained, was exactly the kind of response that suggested they were on the right track. An HOA with nothing to hide would simply provide the requested documents or explain any legitimate reasons for delay. Trying to trade document access for waiving violations was not only ethically questionable, it was potentially illegal. Reeves advised her to respond in writing, declining the offer and reiterating her legal right to the requested documents. He also suggested that she not remove the garden under any circumstances. Doing so would eliminate her standing to challenge the violation and might be seen as an admission that the HOA's rules were valid. Margaret needed to hold her ground, both literally and figuratively. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, unable to sleep, she thought about what she was getting herself into. She had spent most of her life avoiding confrontation, following rules, and keeping her head down. But something had changed. Maybe it was the blatant injustice of being punished for something she had done peacefully for decades. Maybe it was the memory of Robert and everything that garden represented. Or maybe it was simply that she had reached an age where she was tired of being pushed around by people who abused their small amount of power. Whatever the reason, Margaret Chen was no longer backing down. The 30-day deadline came and went, and Margaret's garden remained exactly as it had been, thriving, productive, and completely unauthorized, according to the HOA's interpretation of their rules. On day 31, another certified letter arrived, this one containing the first official fine notice, $500 for the first day of noncompliance, with a stern warning that the daily fines would continue to accumulate until the violation was corrected. The letter included a running total and a projection showing that if she continued her defiance for 90 days, she would owe $45,000. The implication was clear: comply or face financial ruin. Margaret filed the notice with her growing collection of HOA correspondence and continued her research. The 15-day deadline for the HOA to respond to her document request had also passed without any production of records. Reeves had sent a follow-up letter on her behalf, noting the HOA's failure to comply with state law and warning that continued refusal could result in legal action and potential penalties against the board members personally. The response to that letter came from a law firm representing the HOA, claiming that the requested documents were being compiled and would be provided in due course. It was a stalling tactic, and everyone knew it. While she waited, Margaret decided to do some investigating of her own. She began by taking long walks around Willowbrook Estates, something she had done for years as part of her daily exercise routine, but now with a more critical eye. She started noticing things that had previously escaped her attention. Many homes had minor violations of the enhanced guidelines that were apparently being ignored. The house 2 doors down from the HOA president's residence had a basketball hoop in the driveway, which according to Section 4.2.8 was prohibited unless stored out of sight when not in use. The hoop had been there for at least 2 years, permanently installed, yet that homeowner had never received a violation notice. 3 streets over, she noticed that a homeowner had installed decorative shutters that were painted a shade of blue not listed on the approved color palette. The enhanced guidelines were very specific about exterior colors. Every shade of paint, every trim color, every accent had to be selected from a pre-approved list. Yet these bright cerulean shutters had been up for over a year without issue. As Margaret continued her walk, she documented at least 17 clear violations of the enhanced guidelines that were being completely ignored by the HOA. She photographed each one with her smartphone, carefully noting the addresses and the specific rule violations. The pattern that emerged was troubling. The homeowners being targeted with violations and fines seemed to fall into specific categories: elderly residents living on fixed incomes, single parents, and anyone who had previously questioned the HOA board at meetings or complained about assessment increases. Meanwhile, the homes of board members and their apparent friends enjoyed immunity from enforcement. It was selective persecution disguised as rules enforcement, and Margaret was building a documentary record of the hypocrisy. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One morning, while Margaret was working in her garden despite the accumulating fines, her neighbor from across the street walked over. Helen Rodriguez was in her early 60s, a widow like Margaret, and someone she had exchanged pleasantries with over the years, but had never been particularly close to. Helen looked nervous as she approached, glancing around as if worried someone might see her talking to Margaret. Helen explained that she had been following Margaret's situation with the HOA and felt compelled to share something she had witnessed. 3 months earlier, Helen had been unable to sleep one night and was reading in her living room around 2 a.m. when she noticed something unusual. Richard Hutchinson's distinctive silver Porsche SUV, which normally sat in his driveway, drove past her house and turned onto the main boulevard leading out of the neighborhood. This wouldn't have been particularly notable, except for what happened next. About 30 minutes later, a large commercial truck with Premier Landscaping Solutions written on the side entered the neighborhood and drove to one of the common areas near the community pool and clubhouse. Helen, curious and unable to sleep anyway, had walked down to where the truck was parked. Hidden by the darkness and some ornamental trees, she watched as workers unloaded what appeared to be premium plants, decorative boulders, and high-end landscaping materials. The work continued for several hours. The next morning, Helen walked past the area and saw that the entire landscape bed around the clubhouse had been completely redone with expensive materials. At the next HOA board meeting, Richard Hutchinson had announced with pride that the clubhouse landscaping renovation had been completed under budget at a cost of $12,000, funded from the Community Improvement Reserve Fund. But Helen knew what she had seen. The amount of materials and labor that went into that project in the middle of the night looked like it would cost far more than $12,000. She had obtained quotes for landscaping work at her own home and knew the going rates. The night work alone would have commanded premium pricing. Something didn't add up, but Helen had been too intimidated to say anything at the time. Now, seeing Margaret being persecuted over a vegetable garden, she felt obligated to speak up. Margaret thanked Helen profusely and immediately documented her statement in writing, having Helen sign and date it. This was exactly the kind of evidence she needed: potential financial fraud involving HOA funds and a board president who might be receiving kickbacks or stealing from the community. Margaret called David Reeves and relayed the
information. The attorney was intrigued and suggested they needed to get those financial records more urgently. He would file a motion in court to compel the HOA to produce the requested documents if they didn't comply within the next week. True to his word, Reeves filed the motion, and the HOA was ordered by a judge to produce the requested financial records within 10 days or face contempt charges. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the request was overly broad and burdensome, but the judge was unsympathetic. These were standard financial records that any properly managed organization should be able to produce readily. The order was clear and unambiguous.
When the documents finally arrived, they came in a haphazard mess of unsorted papers stuffed into 3 cardboard boxes. It was clearly an attempt at malicious compliance, technically providing the documents but making them as difficult to review as possible. Margaret and David Reeves spent an entire afternoon sorting through the chaos, organizing bank statements, canceled checks, and vendor invoices into chronological order. What they found was even worse than Margaret had imagined. The financial records revealed a pattern of suspicious transactions spanning 3 years, coinciding almost exactly with when Richard Hutchinson had been elected HOA president. Vendor invoices often lacked detailed descriptions of services provided. Many checks were made out to companies with generic names like Community Solutions LLC and property management specialists that Margaret couldn't find any online presence for when she searched. Most damning were the landscaping expenses. Over 3 years, the HOA had paid Premier Landscaping Solutions over $250,000 for various projects around the community, yet Margaret could identify only about half that amount in actual visible improvements. Reeves suggested they hire a forensic accountant to review the records professionally, someone who could testify as an expert witness if needed. Margaret agreed, though the cost was mounting. She had already spent nearly $8,000 on legal fees, and the fines on her garden violation had now accumulated to over $15,000, according to the HOA's calculations. She was committed to seeing this through, but the financial pressure was real and growing. The forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in fraud investigation, took 2 weeks to complete her analysis. Her findings were delivered in a comprehensive report that laid out the evidence in devastating detail. At least $120,000 in HOA funds appeared to have been misappropriated over 3 years, through various schemes including inflated vendor invoices, payments to shell companies, and kickback arrangements. The report identified Richard Hutchinson as the common thread in all suspicious transactions, with strong evidence suggesting he had personally benefited from the fraud, but Dr. Chen had found something else, something that made Margaret's garden dispute seem almost trivial by comparison. The enhanced architectural and landscape guidelines that were being used to justify violations and fines had never been properly adopted. There was no record of a homeowner vote, no properly noticed special meeting, and no documentation of the required approval process. The board had simply created these rules unilaterally and enforced them as if they were legitimate. Every fine collected under these invalid rules was potentially theft, and the HOA had collected over $300,000 in violation fines over 3 years. Margaret sat in David Reeves's office as he explained their options. They now had evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and potentially racketeering. This was no longer a simple HOA dispute. It was a criminal matter that needed to be reported to law enforcement. But Reeves wanted to be strategic. If they went to the authorities immediately, the HOA board would lawyer up and the investigation could take years. Instead, he suggested they first confront the board with the evidence at a special meeting, giving them a chance to resign and make restitution. If they refused, then they would file criminal complaints and civil lawsuits simultaneously. Margaret agreed to the strategy, though part of her wanted to see Richard Hutchinson arrested immediately. Reeves drafted a letter to the HOA board informing them that serious financial irregularities had been discovered and requesting an emergency special meeting of all homeowners to address the issues. The letter didn't detail the specific findings but made it clear that legal action was imminent if the board didn't cooperate. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks away, giving the board time to consult with their attorneys and homeowners, time to receive proper notice under the bylaws. As Margaret left the attorney's office that day, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. She had been right about the corruption, but knowing the full extent of it made her angry about how many homeowners had been victimized. People had paid thousands in illegitimate fines, believing they were in the wrong when the entire enforcement system had been a fraud from the beginning. Her garden violation was just one small part of a much larger criminal enterprise. The 3 weeks leading up to the special meeting were a whirlwind of activity and tension. Margaret had expected the HOA board to respond to the meeting request with their usual dismissive arrogance, but instead, something unexpected happened. Richard Hutchinson himself called her home phone number on a Tuesday evening, his voice dripping with false friendliness and concern. He suggested they meet privately to discuss what he called a misunderstanding about the financial records. He offered to personally ensure her garden violation was dismissed and even hinted that the HOA might compensate her for her legal expenses if she would agree to drop the matter quietly. Margaret, following David Reeves's advice, politely declined and told Hutchinson that any discussions needed to happen at the properly noticed special meeting with all homeowners present. The desperation in his voice before he hung up told her everything she needed to know about how worried the board had become. Word of the special meeting spread through Willowbrook Estates like wildfire. The official notice that was mailed to all 347 homeowners in the community was deliberately vague, stating only that significant governance and financial matters would be discussed and that all residents were strongly encouraged to attend. But Margaret had been busy making phone calls and sending emails to the homeowners she had connected with during her research. Patricia Morrison, Tom Weber, Helen Rodriguez, and several others became informal ambassadors, sharing what they knew with their neighbors and encouraging everyone to show up. The narrative that began circulating through the community was that something major was about to be revealed, something that affected every single homeowner who had ever paid dues or received a violation notice. David Reeves had been busy as well. He had arranged for Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic accountant, to attend the meeting and present her findings. He had also taken the precaution of inviting a representative from the state's Department of Real Estate, which oversaw HOA regulations and had the authority to investigate complaints of financial mismanagement. Additionally, Reeves had contacted a detective he knew in the county district attorney's fraud division, sharing the basic outline of what had been discovered. While the detective couldn't attend the meeting, he had expressed significant interest in receiving a formal complaint with supporting documentation once the special meeting concluded. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse, a spacious facility that had been built with HOA funds and was normally used for social gatherings and exercise classes. Margaret arrived 45 minutes early, accompanied by David Reeves and Dr. Chen. They set up a laptop and projector at the front of the room, preparing to display key financial documents and charts that would illustrate the fraud. As they worked, homeowners began filtering in, and it quickly became apparent that this would be the most well-attended HOA meeting in Willowbrook Estates history. By 6:45, every seat in the Bull clubhouse was filled, and homeowners were standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway. Margaret estimated that at least 200 people had shown up, an unprecedented turnout for a community where most meetings attracted fewer than a dozen attendees. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and anger. Many homeowners wore expressions of confusion, unsure of what exactly they were about to witness, but sensing that something significant was happening. The HOA board members arrived at 6:55, walking in together as if presenting a united front. Richard Hutchinson led the group, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying himself with the same arrogant confidence he always displayed. Sandra Vega, Marcus Chen, and Jennifer Walsh followed behind him, though Margaret noticed they seemed far less comfortable than their president. They took their seats at the head table facing the assembled homeowners, and Hutchinson called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. Hutchinson began with what was clearly a prepared statement, acknowledging that some homeowners had raised questions about HOA finances and governance. He spoke in the smooth, condescending tone of someone accustomed to controlling narratives, assuring everyone that the board had always acted in the community's best interests. He suggested that any perceived irregularities were simply the result of complex accounting practices that lay people might not understand. He then attempted to move the meeting to a vote on unrelated matters, clearly hoping to run out the clock and avoid the real issues. David Reeves stood up and interrupted, citing the bylaws that required any homeowner to be given an opportunity to speak on matters properly noticed for discussion. Hutchinson tried to argue that the meeting agenda didn't include specific discussion items, but Reeves was prepared. He had filed the proper paperwork under the bylaws to add agenda items, including a presentation of financial findings and a vote of no confidence in the current board. The bylaws were clear, and even Hutchinson's attorney, who was seated at the side of the room, nodded reluctantly that Reeves was correct. Trapped by the very rules he had used to silence others for years, Hutchinson had no choice but to allow Margaret to address the assembly. She walked to the front of the room, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady as she began to speak. She started by telling her own story, explaining how a vegetable garden she had maintained for over 20 years had suddenly become grounds for $50,000 in fines. She showed photos of her garden, which looked neat and productive, nothing like the eyesore the HOA had characterized it as. Many homeowners nodded sympathetically, and several called out that they had received similar arbitrary violations. Then Margaret shifted to the larger issues. She explained how her research into the HOA's governance had revealed procedural violations in how the enhanced guidelines had been adopted. She displayed the bylaws on the projector screen, highlighting the sections that required homeowner votes for such amendments. She showed the conspicuous absence of any voting records or properly noticed meetings. The implications rippled through the crowd. If the enhanced guidelines were invalid, then so were all the fines collected under them. But Margaret was just getting started. She introduced Dr. Sarah Chen, who proceeded to deliver a devastating presentation of the financial analysis. Using charts and graphs that made the data accessible even to those without accounting backgrounds, Dr. Chen walked the homeowners through the pattern of suspicious transactions. She showed invoices from premier landscaping solutions that billed for services that couldn't be verified. She displayed payments to shell companies that had no legitimate business presence. She demonstrated how at least $120,000 in HOA funds had disappeared over 3 years through what could only be described as systematic fraud. The room erupted in angry murmurs and shouted questions. Homeowners who had struggled to pay their assessments while believing the money was going to community improvements now learned that a significant portion had been stolen. People who had paid thousands in violation fines now understood they had been victimized by a corrupt board enforcing invalid rules. The anger was palpable, and it was directed squarely at the board members seated at the head table. Richard Hutchinson attempted to respond, claiming the accusations were baseless and that the financial records were being misinterpreted. But his usual confident demeanor had cracked, and his explanations sounded hollow even to those who wanted to believe him. When homeowners began asking specific questions about individual transactions, Hutchinson couldn't provide satisfactory answers. He deflected, blamed the management company, and accused Margaret of conducting a witch hunt because she was bitter about her garden violation. That accusation proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Patricia Morrison stood up and described how she had been forced to pay $3,000 in fines for parking in her own driveway. Tom Weber recounted how his questions about finances had been silenced at previous meetings. Helen Rodriguez nervously but firmly described what she had witnessed that night when landscaping work was done under suspicious circumstances. One by one, homeowners began sharing their own stories of arbitrary violations, excessive fines, and the board's abuse of power. What Hutchinson had meant as a deflection had instead opened a floodgate of testimony that painted a damning picture of systematic corruption and intimidation. David Reeves then took control of the meeting, calmly explaining the legal situation. The evidence suggested criminal fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. He recommended that the homeowners immediately vote to remove the entire board from their positions and elect an interim board to work with authorities during the investigation. He also recommended that the association file a lawsuit against the board members personally to recover the stolen funds and seek damages for the harm caused to the community. The vote was overwhelming. Of the 203 homeowners present, 198 voted to remove the board immediately. Only 5 voted against, and Margaret suspected those 5 were either friends of the board members or too intimidated to vote for change. The board was given 30 days to vacate their positions and turn over all HOA documents, keys, and access codes to the newly elected interim board. Richard Hutchinson sat frozen in his seat as the vote was announced, the color drained from his face. Sandra Vega was crying softly. Marcus Chen had his head in his hands. Only Jennifer Walsh seemed to have any composure left, and she immediately stood and announced she was resigning effective immediately, distancing herself from the others. The meeting adjourned in chaos, with angry homeowners surrounding the former board members, demanding answers while David Reeves and Margaret quietly packed up their presentation materials. As Margaret walked to her car that night, she felt exhausted but vindicated. The community had been awakened to the truth, and justice was finally within reach. But she knew this was far from over. The legal battles were just beginning, and the former board members would likely fight back with everything they had. The morning after the special meeting, Margaret woke to find her phone flooded with text messages and voicemails from homeowners she barely knew. The community was energized in a way she had never witnessed before, with residents volunteering to help with the investigation, sharing their own experiences with HOA abuse, and offering support for what they now saw as a fight for justice that affected everyone. The newly elected interim board, which included Tom Weber as president and Patricia Morrison as treasurer, held an emergency organizational meeting in Patricia's living room and immediately began the process of securing HOA assets and documents before the former board members could destroy evidence or transfer funds. David Reeves had wasted no time filing formal complaints with multiple authorities. The district attorney's fraud division opened an official investigation within 48 hours of receiving the detailed documentation package that included Dr. Chen's forensic analysis, copies of suspicious financial records, and sworn statements from multiple homeowners. The state's Department of Real Estate also launched a parallel investigation into whether the HOA management company had failed in its oversight duties. The walls were closing in on Richard Hutchinson and his co-conspirators, and they knew it. What Margaret didn't anticipate was how desperate cornered people could become. 4 days after the special meeting, she discovered that someone had accessed her email account and deleted several folders containing correspondence about the HOA investigation. Her computer had also been infected with malware that appeared designed to corrupt files. The attack was sophisticated enough that Margaret immediately reported it to the police and hired a cybersecurity consultant to secure her systems. The consultant found evidence that the intrusion had originated from an IP address registered to a commercial office building in downtown, where Richard Hutchinson maintained a real estate investment business. The attempted evidence tampering only added another potential criminal charge to the growing list, but if Hutchinson thought intimidation would work, he had badly miscalculated. Margaret had been meticulous about creating backup copies of everything, storing documents both in cloud services and on external hard drives kept in a safe deposit box at her bank. The attempted destruction of evidence only strengthened her resolve and provided prosecutors with additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details emerged. The interim board gained access to the HOA's bank accounts and discovered something that made even the previous fraud seem modest by comparison. There was a second bank account that had never been disclosed to homeowners, opened in the HOA's name but with only Richard Hutchinson and Marcus Chen listed as signatories. This secret account contained over $400,000, money that appeared to have been systematically siphoned from the main operating account through fictitious expenses and inflated invoices over a period of 5 years, predating even the enhanced guidelines scheme. The forensic accountant was brought back to analyze this new discovery, and her expanded report painted a picture of a sophisticated embezzlement operation. Hutchinson and Chen had created an entire network of shell companies with names similar to legitimate vendors. When the HOA needed actual services like pool maintenance or landscape work, legitimate companies would be hired, but the invoices submitted to the HOA for payment would be inflated by 30 to 50%. The legitimate vendors would be paid the actual amount owed, and the excess would be funneled into accounts controlled by the shell companies, which then transferred the money to the secret HOA account. From there, Hutchinson and Chen would periodically withdraw funds through checks made out to cash or transfers to personal accounts disguised as reimbursements for HOA expenses they had supposedly paid out of pocket. The sophistication of the scheme suggested this wasn't the first time Hutchinson had done something like this. David Reeves began investigating Hutchinson's background and discovered he had served on the boards of 2 other HOAs in neighboring communities before joining Willowbrook Estates. Reeves reached out to contacts in those communities and found a troubling pattern. Both of those HOAs had experienced financial irregularities during Hutchinson's tenure, but in both cases Hutchinson had resigned before any formal investigations could be completed, and the communities had chosen not to pursue the matter further to avoid the expense and embarrassment of litigation. This revelation prompted the district attorney to expand the investigation to potential pattern racketeering charges.
If Hutchinson had been running the same scam across multiple communities over many years, the total amount stolen could be well over $1 million. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a sharp and tenacious assistant district attorney named Rebecca Torres, began coordinating with authorities in the adjacent counties to build a comprehensive case. Meanwhile, the homeowners of Willowbrook Estates were dealing with the practical aftermath of the scandal. The interim board faced the difficult task of unwinding 3 years of invalid fines and violations while managing a community whose trust in
governance had been shattered. They established a claims process for homeowners who had paid fines under the illegitimate enhanced guidelines, ultimately determining that over 200 homeowners were entitled to refunds totaling nearly $350,000. The secret account funds would help cover these refunds, but there would be a significant shortfall that might require a special assessment or years of careful budget management to resolve. Margaret's own garden violation was among the first to be officially voided, and the accumulated fines of over $23,000 were erased with a formal letter of apology from the interim board. But Margaret felt no sense of personal victory in this. Her garden had never really been the point. She had stumbled into a much larger fight, one that affected hundreds of families who had been systematically victimized by people they had trusted to manage their community responsibly. 6 weeks after the special meeting, Richard Hutchinson, Marcus Chen, and Sandra Vega were arrested at their homes in coordinated early morning raids. Jennifer Walsh, who had cooperated with investigators and provided testimony about the board's activities, was not charged but faced potential civil liability. The arrest warrants alleged multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Hutchinson's bail was set at $500,000, which he struggled to post, suggesting that despite stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars, much of it had already been spent on the lavish lifestyle he had been living. The arrest made local news, with television crews filming the perp walk and reporters detailing the elaborate scheme to defraud homeowners. The story struck a nerve with the public, as HOA horror stories resonated with the millions of Americans who lived in similar communities and had their own tales of petty tyranny and financial opacity. Margaret found herself reluctantly in the spotlight, giving interviews to reporters who wanted to know how an elderly librarian had taken down a corrupt HOA board. She deflected credit, emphasizing that it was the community coming together that had made the difference, but privately she knew that if she hadn't been willing to fight over her garden, none of this would have come to light. The criminal case moved forward with surprising speed, aided by the overwhelming documentary evidence and Marcus Chen's decision to accept a plea bargain in exchange for testimony against Hutchinson. Chen admitted his role in the scheme and provided details about how Hutchinson had recruited him and structured the fraud. According to Chen, Hutchinson had approached him shortly after joining the HOA board with what he described as a foolproof plan to skim money from the association. Chen, who was struggling financially after a business failure, had been tempted by the promise of easy money and had convinced himself that they were only taking from a pool of funds that homeowners wouldn't miss. The rationalization had become harder to maintain as the scheme expanded, and the amounts stolen grew larger, but by then Chen felt trapped and afraid of what Hutchinson might do if he tried to back out. Sandra Vega's role had been more passive but still culpable. As vice president, she had signed off on financial reports and approved expenditures without asking questions, either out of deliberate complicity or willful blindness. Prosecutors believed she had received indirect benefits from the scheme, including landscaping work at her home that was billed to the HOA as community improvements, but proving her knowledge and intent would be more difficult than with Hutchinson and Chen. As the criminal proceedings unfolded, David Reeves filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit on behalf of the HOA against all the former board members, seeking recovery of all stolen funds, plus punitive damages, attorney's fees, and costs. The lawsuit also named the HOA management company that had been hired to oversee the association's operations, alleging that their negligent failure to detect obvious fraud made them partially liable for the losses. The management company immediately filed for bankruptcy protection, though their insurance carrier agreed to participate in settlement negotiations. Margaret attended many of the court hearings, sitting quietly in the gallery and watching as the legal system ground through the process of holding the perpetrators accountable. She saw Richard Hutchinson in court multiple times
and each appearance showed a man more diminished than before. The arrogant HOA president, who had once wielded power over hundreds of families, now looked haggard and defeated, his expensive suits replaced with off-the-rack courtroom attire, his confident demeanor replaced with the hunched posture of someone facing the very real prospect of years in prison. The case was building toward trial, but as often happened in cases with overwhelming evidence, plea negotiations began in earnest. The district attorney's office was willing to offer reduced sentences in exchange for full restitution and cooperation, but Hutchinson refused to accept any deal that involved admitting guilt or serving more than minimal jail time. His lawyers filed motion after motion seeking to suppress evidence or dismiss charges, but each motion was denied. The evidence was simply too strong, the documentation too complete, and the testimony from victims too compelling.